Welcome to City and State's latest online discussion on the coronavirus pandemic. Our topic today is the financial and economic impact of the crisis. I'm Jon Lentz, City and State's editor-in-chief. We have a lot of ground to cover and only an hour to do so. So we'll share the bios of our panelists with links in the chat room if you want to read more about them. Now I'm pleased to welcome New York City Comptroller Scott Stringer and New York State Department of Financial Services Superintendent Linda Lacewell. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
But first, before we get underway, a word from our sponsor. This webinar is sponsored by Leverace Assessments. We'll now hear from Kiana Beckles, the firm's founder and CEO.
Greetings all. I want to thank you for continuing to host these types of events. City and state events are a great opportunity for politicians, business owners, and the community to come together. And I just want to, I want to reiterate, thank you, Scott Stringer, for a lot of the resources that you've been putting together. You were on the town hall the other day with Senator Brian Benjamin and talking about, new resources that we can use to bring the city together to support small businesses, to support New York's economy. And I want to thank you. And I also want to say, keep us as your front line. Small businesses are your front line for the revitalization of the New York economy. So we're here to work together with you, and all those ideas that we were bouncing around the other day, let's continue to do that.
Thank you.
Great, thank you, Kiana. And now for our audience, just so you know, there's a few functions on Zoom that I'll point out. To ask a question, you can click on the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. We will take some questions from the audience at the end of the hour as time permits. You can also interact with other webinar attendees through the chat function at the bottom of your screen. Please use the drop-down box to share comments with all attendees and not just the panelists. And please do keep it civil and on point. You can also change the view settings on the top right-hand corner of your screen. And now back to our panelists. And first I should note, Superintendent Lacewell, you're here to speak about DFS actions in the state during COVID-19 and not on behalf of the governor or the executive chamber, just to clarify that. And first, a question for both of you, and Superintendent, we'll start with you, then over to the Comptroller. How bad is the situation economically in New York? Superintendent.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. Really enjoy working with City and State, and a pleasure to be with you, Mr. Comptroller. And remember our last event with a ribbon cutting at a new bank in Manhattan, Piedmont, and that was a beautiful occasion and a distant memory at this point with distancing. Yeah. Look, there's no question, of course, lives lost is astronomical, and even one life, as the governor says, is tragic, both for the community and to those who cared for that person. At the same time, this has had a devastating effect on our economy. With respect to unemployment, it has been especially impactful. And it's hard to believe that unemployment was at a 50-year low as recently as February at 3.5%, and in April spiked more than 10 percentage points to 14.7, which is an 80-year high. So that really tells the picture. And, Wall Street hates uncertainty. And I think that's what we've seen from the beginning, a little bit of the roller coaster. But Wall Street tends to know how to take care of itself. And what we are seeing, unfortunately, is Main Street and at home really suffering. Not only the small businesses who have been unable really to operate and may be unable to operate with the kind of margins that they're going to have to deal with social distancing as things reopen. And those are typically also families. It's usually a small number of people running what we think of as a small business, as opposed to what Washington may think of as a small business. So we've got to find ways of helping people to get back to work, generating jobs. Look, the Federal Reserve, Jay Powell, the statements that he has put out, I'm old enough to remember the days when the Fed chairman spoke and they said it was Sphinx-like, right? And you had to try to do like, the analysis, the Kremlin-esque analysis as to what various words meant. He is being very direct. He is being very direct that we have got a major problem. I think the Fed has really, stood up and been helpful from the liquidity point of view. The Congress has been helpful so far, but it's not enough. We've got to get money. We've got to continue to get money to people who are out of work, who don't have income, who can't pay the bills. And we've got to help small business. We've got to get money to small business, to Main Street, and not just Wall Street.
Sure, thank you, Superintendent. And Comptroller, over to you. And I'll note that you are issuing, I think, weekly updates on the financial health of the city. But if you could sum up where we are right now and what it looks like going forward.
Well, first of all, let me just start by just saying thank you for giving me this opportunity. And I was very excited to be here with Linda Lacewell, because her understanding of the economy, not just from a state perspective, but from our national, international markets, is very important as we move forward. So it's great to be here with Linda. And I think she laid out some of the challenges. Let me just double down a little bit. We do have 1 in 4 New Yorkers unemployed. That's close to 950,000 people. That is truly an extraordinary number. We're seeing, coming out of the city, a multi-billion-dollar budget deficit. We thought we were at $8.7 billion. The mayor has now said add an additional $1.6 billion. So the budget challenge has become front and center in our city and in our state, and the state is no better off. They're at about 13 billion, Linda, I think, at last count, and probably climbing. So the challenge to the city has never been anything like this. Some compare this to the Great Recession in 2008. I would argue we have to go back to the Depression to see a similar situation. And part of what we have to do now in government is we have to figure out a financial sustainability package. It starts with the federal government, a real stimulus package for state and localities. I find it unbelievable that New York City, which is the center of the pandemic, with close to 200,000 coronavirus cases, gets about $9,000 per case from the federal government. Montana, with 470 cases, gets $2.7 million per corona case. So much of the stimulus has become political, and now we must ensure that the next tranche goes to where it's needed the most, to our state and to our city. We have people who literally can't pay rent. They want to pay rent, they can't pay rent, they don't have a job. People can't pay mortgages. We look at this economy now as we come out of the worst of the virus, and we now have to think strategically about slowly turning on the economy. But one argument that I think is critical is, even in this pandemic, we do have an opportunity to fundamentally learn from the coronavirus, because this virus discriminates. It hit the communities that had the greatest health disparities. It hit the communities that had the largest housing crisis. It hit communities of color more than anywhere else, because for years, we have not, as a city, invested in solving health and other economic issues in communities. So when people say turn on the economy, I agree with Linda. Wall Street ultimately will be fine, and Amazon is going to be fine. The people that we have to watch out for are our friends and neighbors, the frontline workers, because right now they're not fine, and the city has not stepped up to make sure they're fine. And that is something we're going to have to really talk about going forward.
Sure, and both of you hit on the role of the federal government here. If we could elaborate on that, is the main thing we want the federal government to provide, to bail out the city and the state and to be able to deal with these huge budget shortfalls? Is there anything else that's just as important from an economic or fiscal perspective that the federal government needs to do? And Superintendent, maybe I'll start with you.
Sure. Well, Scott is exactly right that unfortunately the dollars to date have been politicized. The dollars should follow the need. The states that are the most impacted are the ones that need the most help. It's tautological. And, beyond that, we are in a situation where we have people who need the most help. The PPP dollars for the payroll protection plan, those need to go to businesses that have fewer workers to have the bigger impact. And the dollars need to be spent for the benefit of those workers. And it is possible to do it. It's just that, you know, folks seem to forget it's not a bailout for the state. It's not a bailout for a city. This is about addressing the needs of the people. The state and the cities are the ones that are paying for the police and the fire and the hospitals and the healthcare workers. These are the people, and the teachers. These are the people who are at risk if dramatic budget shortfalls continue. And so the president has said, well, it's for the state to do the testing and the tracing and the reopening and the standards and the enforcement and everything else, as the governor says. Well, the least that the federal government can do is to be there with the relief that the states need in order to do this critically important work.
Sure. And Comptroller?
You know, I think right now for me, as we look at the looming budget crisis, I really do think we need a robust stimulus package. And I'm sure we're going to talk about what New York City and New York State has to do as well, but it all centers on a massive multi-billion-dollar stimulus package. We've needed it before, and we got it after 9/11. The federal government has helped, whether it was Hurricane Sandy or other disasters that were out of our control. But this is something that is unprecedented. And the federal government, which contributed so much to the spread of this virus, let's be clear, Donald Trump is responsible for so much of this by ineptitude and incompetence. Obviously, that's spilled milk. But the least that we can get from him and the Senate and the Congress is a stimulus package that will keep people in their homes and let government rebuild. We need stimulus money to slowly rebuild our economy. We can have a debate about what kind of economy we want and for whom, and that's a good debate, but it all starts with the stimulus. And all eyes are on our congressional delegation, which is the best in the nation. They have to work with all of us. We need to organize nationally by bringing together labor, business community, our activists and advocates, our not-for-profit leaders, and make the case that's twofold. One, New York City spends $22 billion or sends $22 billion more to the federal government than we get back. That's a fact. Second, without New York City whole economically, the rest of the nation will suffer and the international markets could collapse. I'm not being alarmist, but New York City, as proven after 9/11, which is why the federal government came in so strong, you need the economy of New York City. It sets the tone for the nation. So if you're a Republican in Montana and you've gotten over on the stimulus package and you think this is just a wonderful time for you, understand that what happens to New York will eventually happen to you.
And if I can just add one point, John, we speak, all of us, in such abstract terms: the federal government, the state government, the city government. Government is in trust for the people. Government is the people. It's not some abstract institution that decides, you know, based on its whims, what to do. We, the people, give the power of the people in trust to the government to act in the interests of the people. And they are supposed to perform for the people. The federal government, through much of this pandemic, was absent. It was not working for the people. They left that burden expressly to the states. The states did the job and spent the money to do the job. And to Scott's point, New York sends back far more in dollars to the federal government than it receives back either in dollars or services, and we help support other states. And we're glad to do it. But at a time where New York has been hit particularly hard, we should not be penalized because we're not the right kind of state. It is the obligation of government to serve the people, irrespective of politics, and people need help. The states and the cities need help so that they can help the people who are here that we on a day-to-day basis help. Businesses need help. The PPP program needs to be extended and improved so that it helps people to reopen. And yes, we are all connected. And if New York can reopen and we can get the economy going here, it will make us robust. We'll be able to continue to help other states. The economy is connected, not just within the state, but nationally and globally. And this idea that, you know, we're going to play politics with those decisions is ultimately self-defeating.
And Comptroller, you alluded to, you know, trying to put pressure on the federal government to act, though, you know, there's only so much that can be done. The federal government has to act. You also alluded to things that are being done, maybe should be done, the city and state level. There are actions that are being taken or proposals being considered. I guess what more can be done apart from federal action, and from each of your perspectives, what are you doing to improve the situation? And Comptroller, let's start with you.
Look, one of the things that I've long said at City Council budget hearings, to anybody who would listen at various forums, that it's critical that the New York City government saves for that rainy day catastrophe that seems to come our way. We saw it back in the 1970s when we were on the edge of bankruptcy and we almost went under. And through that, we created budget reforms and mechanisms so that we would never fall into that same trap. We had 9/11, where we had real issues with our economy. Any savings we had quickly evaporated. That was true after the Great Recession. It was true after Hurricane Sandy. We see this time and time again. In the last 7 years, we have not saved adequately. We've been on a spending spree. A lot of that for very good reasons, to help pre-K and other important issues that I supported. But at the end of the day, we didn't save enough. We went from 18% of savings to 8.9% of savings. I'm not someone who claims to foresee the future, and I don't want to give you that impression because that's not me. But when I went to the City Council budget hearing in February, I said, look, you got to put away more money, people, because yes, it's good times. You know, Linda said record unemployment. We had record surpluses. So it's hard to imagine having to put away any money when you've had record budget surpluses for many, many years, for 10 years or so. And no one put away the money. And I said in February, we're going to have to put away more money in this year's budget because you never know the unknown, what's going to come our way. Now, I didn't realize that just in a few weeks, we would be on the verge of economic collapse with a pandemic, the likes we've never seen. So part of what we have to learn from this is government can't always play to the crowd. You have to have a long game to protect the city. And having said that, we now are faced with a record budget surplus that has to be closed. And right now it's $1.6 billion. And we have to now step up and come up with a plan to do that. And I believe that negotiations between the council and the mayor must come up with a budget plan. I have my opinions that we can get into, but I do think we have to remember that part of the lesson here is we didn't really prepare for the unknown. And whatever we do going forward, we have to make sure that we do that. Second, I just want to say that when we prepare for the unknown, I'm shocked that when we had this crisis, the first thing that we went for, they went for the children. They tried to cancel, they're trying to cancel a summer program for 175,000 kids. They're canceling the beaches and the pools. And it just seems like, once again, anytime there's a budget deficit, they come for the people who have no voice to fight back. And we got to make sure that we don't dump on the most vulnerable people in the city. There are tough decisions that have to be made, but we don't have to go after our frontline workers, our kids, and others. And I hope to talk about that today.
Yes, sir. No, we'll get to more of that later, some of the issues with the city's budget that have come up. But Superintendent, I did want to hear from you. Anything that can be done or is being done apart from federal action, and specifically at DFS, what you are doing?
Yes, thank you for that. So as you know, the Department of Financial Services is the regulator of insurance and state chartered banking and a whole host of financial services and products. And our agencies, our licensed entities have, trillions of dollars worth of assets under their purview. And it includes things that affect your daily life. It's health insurance, car insurance, mortgage payments. So one of the first things that we did when this pandemic hit and people had to be inside was we worked with industry and we arranged for mortgage payments to be able to be deferred for 90 days and put that at the end of the loan because people don't have the money to pay their mortgage. And we also took similar action with respect to life insurance, which the industry largely worked with us on that, and also for property and casualty, such as homeowners insurance, car insurance, things of the like. Because people don't have money coming in and they can't pay these bills. They've got to worry about, the groceries and taking care of their family directly. Also, importantly, we worked very closely with our health insurance industry to try to reduce the pressure on the hospital system, right? Because during the heart of the crisis, as the admissions were really mounting within our hospital systems, they really could not afford to be distracted by the need to do a lot of bureaucratic paperwork with respect to pre-approvals and concurrent approvals and post-approvals, and a lot of other sort of more bureaucratic requirements that we had waived so that our frontline heroes in the hospitals could focus exclusively on saving lives of people affected by the pandemic. And these are just some of the things that we did, but I think it shows on a granular level how government can actually help people. And from the beginning, we've put the consumer at the center of what we do, even though we regulate industry and we're responsible for their safety and soundness, because everything that we do and everything that our industries do at the end of the day affects a real person, a family, a small business, and that's what it's really all about. So we have maintained that thread. And I would say also to your question, innovation remains critically important. We created the first research and innovation division at DFS to focus on fintech, insurtech, and other types of innovation, which are clearly going to be more critical than ever now in this new world that we are emerging into, with the need to be able to do things virtually, and how do we help people to do that, and how do we examine banks and insurance companies without needing to send teams of people, into their walls and potentially put people at risk. So innovation and consumer protection are going to continue to be the watchwords at DFS from a state regulatory level.
Sure, and a quick follow-up for you, Superintendent, before we get into some city budget issues. How well are the industries of private sector actors that you oversee, how are they responding? Are they getting in line? Are they doing what you need them to do? Do you really have to push them at all to follow these new regulations and efforts to help consumers and patients?
So for the most part, they get it. I think the banks and most of the insurers have wanted to be helpful as long as we can put reasonable parameters around it. I don't think for those who are in the business, it's any secret that the health insurance industry was a little anxious. I think when change is asked of people, they get nervous and they worry, is this going to be a precedent, and what else will I have to pay for? We said no cost sharing for COVID testing. We said no cost sharing for telehealth on the mental health issues and certain other burdens that we imposed on them. But at the same time, because there's no utilization on the elective procedures, the health insurance industry, I think from a financial point of view, was doing quite well. And at least some of them are talking about some kind of premium rebating in certain parts of the country, which kind of shows that they're doing well. The same thing for auto insurers, because people are not driving right now. So there's no utilization of auto insurance. And so auto insurers on their own, some of them stepped forward and said, we're going to rebate some of these premium dollars. Now, is that good business from a marketing point of view? Absolutely, but it's to the benefit of consumers. And I think also leadership can be found across the spectrum, right? Some of these companies are led by, visionary members of society who want to be good citizens. And they say, the rules be damned, I'm going to give some of this money back and I'll worry about the details of it later. And it's hard to argue with that from a leadership point of view. And we've tried to be supportive there to get them through the thicket of bureaucratic rules where we can.
Sure. And then back to you, Comptroller, you were talking about the city's budget and your efforts as recently as February, calling for savings. And you said you couldn't really tell the future, though, you look back, people like yourself, although city council, over the years has called for regular cuts, the PEG program, something that was common under the Bloomberg administration, ways to just periodically find agency level cuts to avoid waste. It seems like the de Blasio administration, they were warned on this. Why do you think they never really took action. There's all this reporting about how the budget just went up and up and up and more hiring. How did we get here?
Look, I think the reason you do a PEG program is because you got to constantly reimagine the role of the agencies. You have to look at those inefficiencies, how you could do things quicker, faster, better. The money that you save can then go back in to do the programmatic work you want to do. And so the reason you constantly ask the commissioners for those savings is so that it's an evolving, organic exercise. It's just best practice. I just don't think this administration was into that kind of governing. And it is coming back to haunt them. You know, my office is the ultimate savings generator, right? Since I took office, our public finance team, working with OMB, by the way, has generated $2.75 billion in savings from refinancing our bonds. Our audit division conducted 418 audits and special reports. We identified $20 million in actual savings, but we also recommended to city agencies $900 billion in potential revenue that was sitting there if the city was willing to manage that. Now, that's not going to get you a lot of headlines, and that's not something that is going to be reported, but managing the back office of government this way ensures you will have resources when a pandemic or a hurricane or a financial crisis comes. And we keep saying to the mayor to pay attention to this kind of work, because this is how we're going to do our part to get through the financial crisis.
Sure. And following up on that, you recently gave testimony on the city budget just this month. You cited things like an over-reliance on reserves and one-time savings, the need for recurring savings. You know, obviously, it seems like this crisis will not go away overnight. You know, whoever the next mayor may be will have to deal with some of these issues in all likelihood. And obviously, as everyone knows, you are, you know, one of the early front runners for mayor in 2021. What kind of things would you be doing now, or should you win the mayoralty? What kind of things would you be doing, should we be doing to address this issue?
Well, I would immediately go to the hard work of actually getting this budget balanced. There's a number of actions that have to be taken. So let me just address the immediate need right now. $1.6 billion budget deficit. I do think we have enough reserves to draw down some $600 million. We have enough efficiencies that agencies have not yet performed out of laziness. I mean, reoccurring savings, not just one-shots. In my office, for example, I've returned $2.6 million that was sitting there with contracts we weren't using. I gave the money back. And then we did an exercise and showed that we could create 4% reduction without hurting workers, and gave that back to the city. Every elected official should pledge today to take the 4% pledge, from the city council to the borough presidents to all of us, because we have to also lead by example, and then demand commissioners do the same as we are doing. If we do that, we can gain yet another $300 or $400 million in savings. So when you look at $600 million from the reserves, $400 million from efficiencies, and then what I will do as controller, and I'm going to announce it right now with you, is I will work with OMB, with the mayor, and we will realize $400 million in refinancings for this budget so that we can help do that. So we get a third or close to a third in savings. We get a close to a third in efficiencies. I work with the mayor. We generate $400 million in refinancing, lower interest rates. It's in the public space. We realize those savings earlier. We have to be decisive. Then the other thing is, we got to cut some spending, people. And I don't want it to be frontline workers, and I don't want it to be the people who risk their lives every day for the city. I want to look at other personal service options. We call it OTPS for those in government. Think about this. The city spends $2 billion annually for supplies, equipment, materials. They spend $5.4 billion on contractual and professional service contracts, whatever that is. So I wouldn't eliminate all of them, but let's take a 5% cut across agencies. Let's look at non-personnel discretionary spending, outside contract, and save $370 million. Let's start managing to success and really put programs in place to reduce homelessness and help people. And where programs aren't working, like the street homeless outreach program, where homelessness is going up and out the roof, let's look at how we could curtail or save programs. Thrive, which I know everyone likes to beat up on. I'm not really trying to beat up on Thrive, but there are programs in Thrive, the mental health first aid program. I don't know if that's working. School mental health consultants. I don't know if that's working. The public education campaign. I know that's not working. So let's look at ways to save money so that we use the resources we have to do real work. And lastly, the DOE bureaucracy and outside consultants. Oh my God. If Linda Lacewell knew the true extent of this, she'd be sitting in a controller's office demanding that I do more. So last year, DOE spent $382 million more on outside consultants than they did in 2014. I don't know for the life of me what they do, but the headcount at DOE has ballooned to $68 million. I don't mean teachers, I don't mean principals. I'm talking about bureaucrats. A chancellor leaves, but the chancellor doesn't take the bureaucracy with him or her. They leave it for the next chancellor, who then heads on his or her bureaucracy. It's a mess. It has to change. So what I'm giving you today is a roadmap to balance the budget for 21, and then to look at the big ticket items. That's what the council and the mayor should negotiate out. Obviously, there's no such thing as a budget dance anymore. Everyone's got to get into the room and make those strategic decisions. But I'm prepared today to put up $400 million in refinancing, work with OMB. They should call me later today, or the mayor if he wants to, and we will get to work on that.
I just had two other things on the budget I have to ask you about. Borrowing. The mayor seems to be pursuing a bill up in Albany to greatly increase his borrowing capacity. That's gotten some criticism. I believe the governor's put cold water on this idea. Budget watchdogs have said it's a bad idea. To be fair, the mayor, I think, has said, this borrowing would still be a last resort. But Comptroller, your take on this proposal?
So let's talk strategy. Borrowing should be the last resort. There are so many things I just outlined that we can do to balance this budget in 2021, even with this new deficit. That's what we should be focused on. Second, we shouldn't be betting against ourselves. We need to do everything we can to get a stimulus package from the federal government. So showing that we're willing to get our own financial affairs in order and then demanding what's actually for us is strategy number 2. If we don't get the stimulus and things don't go our way, well, then we have borrowing in our back pocket. And that's an option that has been used before carefully, but we have to think about this. The mayor went to Albany and said, I want to borrow $7 billion. There's a $1.6 billion current budget deficit. So that doesn't give people comfort, because if you borrow $7 billion, the debt service on that for 20 years is $500 million a year. So we're basically mortgaging the future of our children to do what exactly? So even if there is a need to borrow, I got to hear from the city hall as to what the plan is. What is the plan if suddenly a large sum of money dropped in your lap? Would you do business as usual? Would you still have these outside consultants? Would you still be wasting money in government? Or would you create an opportunity for people of different backgrounds, people of color, for example, people in the Bronx and Queens, to have real healthcare investment, real economic investment? Would you ensure that any money we borrow from our children would actually go to education and go to healthcare? These are real issues that we have to address. The mayor doesn't just get to Albany and say, give me money. It's not going to happen, and it shouldn't happen until he comes up with a plan. So I've said I'm not against borrowing, but I'm against doing something before it's time. And hopefully we never get to that time. So what I'd rather do is invest $400 million in refinancing of debt for lower interest rates. That's budgetary responsibility in my view.
Sure. And broaden things a bit, any lessons that can be learned from past recessions? And Superintendent, maybe we'll start with you. DFS itself was born in part out of the Great Recession as a response to that. Over to you.
Thank you. Yes, DFS is the merger of banking and insurance. They were two separate state agencies. And one of the first things the governor did when he took office was to merge those together. And the idea was to break down silos and generate better visibility across markets by not worrying about, is this an insurance product? Is it a banking product? Is it something else? Is it an emerging product? And so the legislature said, we're going to have one agency for all financial services and products, including emerging ones. One of the beauties of the way that the law was written is that it allows DFS to take a look at what's emerging that's not regulated yet. That's how we ended up regulating cryptocurrency, the Bitcoin license, and things of the like, because there was a gap in regulation. So, and also ensuring that there's a robust consumer protection piece within the same agency. And that has really been a powerful thing for New York, and I'll tell you why. Because DFS, with those combined markets, is a real giant in the financial regulatory marketplace. We speak regularly with our counterpart federal regulators, especially now, to make sure that we can see what they're doing and what they're seeing, and we can have input to the extent appropriate, and we can make sure that all the federal regulators are on the same page, where they ought to be on the same page. And, look, DFS, we meet with regulators in Europe as well, because many of the entities that we supervise have dual regulators. The foreign banks are licensed here. And so there were a number of reforms, right, after the last financial crisis, which we believe have made our entities stronger, both in terms of, safety and soundness generally, their capital requirements, and all of the kinds of safeguards that were put into place. From the beginning of this crisis, we've been reaching out to our entities. It is a big part of the economy of New York, Mr. Comptroller, and to make sure that they were ready and what their plans were and what their assessment was of their financial condition. The insurance industry, which I've been speaking with regularly, I think that for the most part, they're in pretty good shape. On the banking side, I don't think we yet know what the extent of defaults are going to be. Helping consumers is not an abstract thing. If consumers can get on their feet, they can pay their bills. You won't have so many defaults. So I would say working closely with our federal regulators and our counterparts, the foreign regulators, keeping an eye on safety and soundness, working for the consumer, pushing Washington to come forward with the funding that is needed to reopen this economy. It's all very much needed. And we need to get money into the hands of people. They will spend the money because they need the money. And that is going to have an economic impact, double, triple, quadruple what the immediate spending dollars are, because these all have ripple effects for other supportive industries.
And to clarify, again, obviously with the Great Depression, banks were really at the center of that crisis. This time around, at least so far, what you're saying is Wall Street's doing okay as best you can tell. And again, obviously DFS, that's a big part of what you regulate is New York chartered banks. But again, Wall Street, is no real issues there that you see?
Well, Wall Street, if you look at the ticker, it seems to be doing fine. And also many of those companies have figured out how to avail themselves of money from Washington. Some of them kept it, some of them gave it back. But small business, right, is the backbone of the economy for the city, for the state, for the nation. And those are the companies that need the money to be impactful and helpful to our economy. So it's really important to find ways to do that. And I think that's one of the things Jay Powell was saying. He was saying, I can be helpful, generally speaking, with liquidity for institutions. I cannot get money in the hands of real people. The Congress has to step up and do that, I think was his, if not overt, his implicit message. And we could not agree more.
Sure. And taking a segue from that, there's a question here about raising revenue, whether at the state level or the city level, whether that's, raising taxes, changing exemptions in some way. Obviously in Albany, there's been talk about over the past couple of years, a pied-à-terre tax, a stock transfer tax, maybe other ways to boost revenue. I mean, DFS, gets these multi-million-dollar settlements from time to time that's helped the state budget. But Comptroller, I would ask you, should the city be looking at any specific strategies to increase revenue?
Look, I've said that we should look at revenue enhancers on many different levels. I've said on the state level that people who've done well over the last 10, 20 years, who've made tremendous amount of money, created tremendous amount of wealth for themselves, should also be called upon in time of crisis. We ask frontline delivery workers to step up and risk their lives to deliver our food. We ask nurses and doctors to step up and risk their lives taking care of our loved ones. We've asked a lot of people in the city, people don't make a lot of money, but they're transit workers and teachers, to risk their lives. And I do think when you raise revenue, we should ask the people with the most to just give a little bit, whether it's temporary or permanent, should we need to do that. Look, at the end of the day, we have to manage the hell out of the city. And we got to make sure the city works. And we can't look for easy way out. And we can't combat disparities once and for all unless we're willing to put everything on the table. And I don't say this to go after one particular group of people. I say this because perhaps the only way we really get out of this is, one, better management, state and city cooperation. And then we need real governance, but we're going to need more revenue. And we have to look everywhere. We just can't cut the lifeline of people. We can't just go after the most vulnerable, which is where the discussion the city has been. We have to do this to ensure results. Look, if we bring back this city, everyone's going to benefit. And I don't buy the argument, and I never buy the argument, that someone who's made a whole lot of money in New York City, if they're asked to do a little bit more, that they're going to jump and move to Florida or Texas for one simple reason. If you move to Texas, you have to live in Texas. No one wants to live anywhere else but the city. That's why people from Texas come to New York. That's why people from all over the world come here. And I want them to come here, people from Ohio and Iowa. And that is what makes New York different from everybody else. So I think people will step up if we need it.
The striking that the mayor, who has long called for a millionaire's tax, raising taxes on the wealthy, is apparently not doing so now. And I think a Politico article just this week on the city budget suggested that maybe he is afraid of that very thing, that given the climate we're in, if you raise taxes on the wealthy, they may leave. There's also a kind of related factor of people who are working from home in the broader downstate region, but maybe they're in Connecticut, maybe they're in New Jersey. Some of these people maybe will not have to pay taxes. I guess, Comptroller, could you follow up on that? You already answered, you don't think people will leave, but elaborate on that. Is there really any risk here losing out on that revenue of people leaving, or also people who are no longer actually physically working in New York City?
Look, one of the things that's becoming clear about this is people who are remotely working from home may very well continue to do that. Businesses may choose to let a sizable part of the workforce do that. That has great tax implications for the city. I don't know what all those implications are right now. I couldn't tell you on paper, but this is going to be reimagining the economy of New York City and perhaps the whole world on these different issues. What I was trying to say is that to a certain extent, given all of the nuance and all of what is going to happen in the new world, as we think about renewing New York City, all of this has to be taken into consideration. I've always believed that what attracts people, business people, young people to the city is our diversity, our special way of life. That life is about interaction, and so we have to figure out how we get back to interaction. So for example, when we think about streetscape, bike lanes, and bus lanes, and seniors walk around, we must ensure that restaurants can now come into the street. I've been saying this for a while, and action's being taken, and that's a good thing. We have to just reimagine the economy. And if we do that well, I do think that people will never want to leave here. And even if those take a brief sabbatical hiding out somewhere, they will make their way back. That I am sure. I'm a kid who grew up in the 70s at the edge of the fiscal crisis. And I remember when the city was on the edge of bankruptcy. Linda may not know this, but my mom served in the city council back then. And my cousin Bella Abzug was a mayoral candidate during that time of Son of Sam and the blackout and 2,000 murders a year. And through it all, there were these pioneers that said, I'm not leaving. You could not get people out of the city. The city could be collapsing, people stay. There's another generation that feels that way today, and we will get people to stay here, even if we ask everybody to do a little bit more.
And I have one more question before we go to some audience questions. Just a quick note for our audience. If you have any questions, please write them in the Q&A. Click that Q&A button, it'll pop up. You can also give a thumbs up to questions you like. And if we get a lot of likes on a question, it'll move it up to the top. Also want to note in our chat, we had one comment about Comptroller, your stack of books. Should Scott Stringer call the Ghostbusters? No human being would stack books like that. And also your copy of The Power Broker. There's a story about that in the New York Times today, how many public officials are having the power broker back behind them on these kinds of calls. But that's actually a good segue to my next question. Obviously, the power broker, it's about Robert Moses, known for his many infrastructure projects. Comptroller, you've talked about the need to invest in capital projects, not to cut back, but in fact to continue to invest in those for the economic impact. Could you elaborate on that? And the governor's also talked about that too. He was up at the White House talking about that very concept with the president. But Comptroller, could you elaborate on that?
You want that, or you want to know the whole bookcase? The bookcase will not fall down. My wife constructs it. That's in the New York Times today. So don't worry about the bookcase, folks, because I get asked that a lot. But actually, you know, Robert Moses and the power broker is very instructive because at the end of the day, ready-made, shovel-made projects are critical to the economy coming back. And our capital project plan is actually not where we're in economic jeopardy. Creating economic projects actually creates jobs and creates revenue and does all the things we want it to do. So I'm very much aligned with that. And, you know, part of what we also have to think about is, you know, how we just reimagine the infrastructure of New York City. And we really have an opportunity now to think about the way we move goods and services, how we get to work different than perhaps we used to. What are our streets really for? Can we look at other places like Paris and London and just have an international conversation about the city that we can now build out? Do we have to continue to be car-centric, or can we look at other modes of transportation? I want to bring back the bus and use dedicated bus lanes, because I think as people get reacquainted with the subway system, busways and interborough busways are all things that we can now really invest in and experiment in, and simply think about what we would be like. You know, Moses was about super highways, the Cross Bronx Expressway, and highways that divided neighborhoods. Maybe if we deconstructed that and created different community-based ways of transportation, we would enhance the economy, grow the economy, and continue to be a magnet for people who now will come to New York, but they also want open space, park space, livability. People don't want to live in pollution. One of the things that the COVID virus showed us is when people don't go out, you know, you may get more animals, but you also have clear skies. And I would hate, maybe this is a lesson or an opportunity for us to think about pollution and clear skies and fossil fuels and all the things that are ultimately killing us as well.
Actually, that's a good segue. Superintendent, your agency has recently made some moves to put more attention on climate change and responding to that over the long run. If you could touch on that briefly.
Yes, thank you. So we recently hired the first sustainability director, climate change and sustainability director for DFS. Why does this matter? Well, our industries, as I mentioned, have trillions of dollars of investments. And what are they investing in? This is a matter not just of climate change as climate change, right? The biggest threat that we all face globally. But it can also go to safety and soundness, which is our core function. If you're an insurance company, you're the one who's covering the losses from the fires and the hurricanes and the floods and all the other remnants of extreme climate that is stemming from climate change. And so what are you doing to mitigate that risk? On the other side of the balance sheet with the assets, what are you investing in? Are you investing in fossil fuels? Are you investing in renewables? Have you identified and measured your risk on that side of the balance sheet? And what are you doing to mitigate that risk? As I have said previously, the Europeans have been way ahead of the US on this. New York, several months ago, was actually the first financial regulator, state or federal, to join the global coalition called the Network for the Greening of the Financial System, which addresses climate change in the context of financial institutions. And we also joined the Sustainable Insurance Forum, which is the insurance side of that equation. But no federal banking regulator has joined that or made it a focal point. And so New York is stepping up, and being New York, we can help influence other states and hopefully ultimately federal regulators to join this as well with respect to entities that they regulate. And we're going to be putting, real resources into this to engage with our industries, again, to be helpful to them on identifying, measuring the risk, and then how are you going to mitigate the risk, which is its whole own exercise. We've met with the British regulators and the French, who are really light years ahead of the United States on this. This is not some illusory made up thing. Prominent regulators across the globe are already dealing with this in a meaningful and collaborative way, and the United States has to do the same.
Going to a couple audience questions. I think this one will be for the Comptroller. Nonprofits citywide are struggling, laying off staff and even closing their doors, yet they're on the front lines of the pandemic response. What can New York City do to reinvest in nonprofits to sustain them? The city will not be able to handle the needs we are seeing on the ground on their own. This includes food, survival needs, health, getting people back to work. SYEP is a good example, canceled with 24-hour notice, etc., leaving nonprofits to fill in the gap for thousands of staff and tens of thousands of kids and families.
Look, I've never understood the administration's relationship with nonprofits. It is just unbelievable how little regard they seem to have for the organizations that do the work. People think that city government actually does all the work, but the truth is there's a network of social service providers for seniors, for people with mental health issues. There are so many organizations that do child care and helping teenagers, and yet we don't prioritize the work that they do. We don't pay them or fringe adequately. We don't ensure that their contract registration goes smoothly. Government holds on to their contracts, buries them in bureaucratic paperwork, and then basically they go from being service providers to simply, hey, we can't pay for our services because the city hasn't given us our reimbursements. We need a complete overhaul about how we treat our not-for-profits. This is something I've worked on for years with the not-for-profit community, and especially in a pandemic, we got to make sure that they have easy ways to access the resources they need to do their food deliveries and all their work. And I could talk about the not-for-profit relationship with city government. It has to change. We should be treating not-for-profits in the same way we treat frontline workers. Without them, we can't provide the services to our parents, grandparents, and the like.
Sure. And a question for the superintendent from the audience. Does DFS have ways to innovate within the agency to help businesses come back?
Great question. And I was just speaking with the agency about that earlier today. We have an ongoing conversation. What I say is we demand a lot of industry, right? We have cybersecurity regulations. I'm talking about climate change as a regulatory matter. We demand a lot. We also have to transform. We also have to innovate. And the backbone of our staff are examiners of banks and insurance companies and other financial institutions. How do they effectively do their job without the need to go inside of a bank or an insurance company or some other entity to look through files? How can we get them to be 100% virtual supervisors? How can we get to virtual supervision, to continual supervision, where it's all on the data and the data analytics, where it's just coming and streaming? We are working very hard on this. We also support innovation through the cryptocurrency license, the BIT license, fintech. We now have a pilot program that our innovation division is doing to be supportive of insurtech companies, which is a burgeoning industry. I think that technology and innovation need to be serious focal points now more than ever to help generate jobs and to help society and to help workers and to help businesses. At the same time, I'm very mindful about the need to strip away obsolete regulations that are affecting businesses. We're in a continual dialogue with business about that, and we do everything that we can in that regard. There's no reason to fill out 10 sets of paperwork if you could do the same thing in 2, or maybe you don't even actually need more than half a page. I'm just sort of giving a made-up example. But we also do other things, like for our banks. If the federal government has a rule that allows a certain activity and it's not harmful to the institution, I have the authority, it's called the wild card, not as exciting as it sounds, but the wild card, where I can say upon notice and comment, we're going to do the same for state entities. And one of the unsung heroes of the financial sector are our state chartered community banks. We've been talking a lot about New York City. These community banks are all across the state. They're all across upstate, the North Country, Western New York, Central New York, everywhere. And they support the people and small businesses of those communities. And we need to make sure we do what we can to maintain what is essentially a financial safety net for the small businesses of those communities. And we're going to be really focused on that. And by the way, we give great service for the state license for any financial institution that is thinking about switching over, and we've had a number of them. So I just wanted to say that about upstate. It's not just the people in the city or even Long Island and Rockland, Westchester. It's the whole state that is going through this. We had more cases downstate. We had more deaths, unfortunately, but the whole state ended up being shut down and everybody was affected on the economics. And upstate, unfortunately, always struggles more than the rest of the state. And I know the governor is focused like a laser beam on upstate, and he will continue to do so. But we need all the inspiration and innovation and ideas and reinvention that we can get. Because as the governor says, if we had to go through it, what are the opportunities to make this a better place and a better way of being and a better way of learning and working and being with each other and getting around from a transportation point of view? There is a world of issues that we need to address in an innovative way.
Thank you, Superintendent. We just have a few minutes left. I'll try to get a couple questions in if you can keep your responses short. One, isn't it time for New York City to establish an Office of Pandemic Research and Response?
I think it's important for us to first figure out who should be in charge of that portfolio. I think we're at a real crossroads given the contact tracing being moved from the Department of Health to a different place with less expertise in contact tracing and pandemic work. Obviously, I'm hoping that it all works out at the end, but I do think we have to rethink our Office of Emergency Management. I'm currently investigating the circumstances around the COVID response, so I don't want to talk too much about it. But we do have to know before we start setting up more agencies, we have to know what the city knew, when they knew it, and what they did about it, especially in the early phases of the virus. And then I think we have to be careful that we don't set up another layer and another layer of bureaucracy. And that is something I really hope we spend time looking at. My office is going to be looking at it, but it would be very important for us to really confer with health professionals, not the politicians. I don't think I have that expertise, quite frankly. I do think we have to get a real sense of how we're going to deal with this issue. And quite frankly, we all know that once the genie's out of the bottle, we're going to have to confront the flow of these viruses, maybe for generations to come.
Sure. And then one last question we'll try to squeeze in here. We've got a few questions along these lines. For those of us that do business with the city, we've welcomed the opportunity to do what's necessary to help and deliver services. That said, payments have completely dried up. It's hurting our ability to pay staff, partners. We're not sure how much longer we can continue to help without getting paid. Comptroller, anything come across your table in terms of city contractors not getting paid or payments getting delayed, or any advice if that's come up?
Well, that's been true with this administration, I hate to say, pre-COVID. So I can only imagine the challenges people have now. Look, what I would say to people who are out there and need help, call my office or leave your name with city and state. We'll follow up with you tomorrow to make sure that your rights are protected. Obviously, we are in the middle of a pandemic. The mayor has used emergency authority in a lot of these situations, so I don't have the same look in right now as I used to, especially with COVID-related contracts. But trust me, we will look back after we get through with the pandemic, or after he declares it okay for us to come back, and then we'll go back to what we do. But please talk to me about it, and we'll try to help.
Sure. Unfortunately, we're just about out of time. I'd like to say thanks again to our sponsor, Leverage Assessments. A final note, we'll be holding additional discussions in our series. The next webinar is on Tuesday, June 2nd on mental health at 2 p.m. We'll certainly hear from Thrive NYC, the program the Comptroller mentioned earlier, to hear what they're doing. Registration can be found on our website. Thank you to everyone in the audience for tuning in. And of course, thank you to our great panelists. That concludes our program.
Thank you.
Good to see you, Linda.
Good to see you, Scott. Be well.
You
Thanks,
too.
everyone.
Thanks.